The Speaking of Cults podcast is presented solely for general informational, educational, and entertainment purposes. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from it is at the user's own risk. The views, information, or opinions expressed by the host and guests are solely those of the individuals involved and do not constitute medical or other professional advice. Okay, welcome to the Speaking of Cults podcast. This is Chris Shelton, your host, and I want to thank you for joining me this week. I am welcoming back Zach Elwood, and the reason that I am doing that is because I find talking with him is just absolutely fun and really interesting to go into what he has spent quite a bit of time specializing in learning about, which is body language and reading people's tells, as they say in poker. The idea of observing somebody's body language, nonverbal cues, as they say, as well as what they are saying and how they are saying it. And you put this whole package together and you kind of get this idea that maybe you can tell more about what a person is thinking, intending, meaning than they're telling you. And maybe even be able to see through active efforts to deceive or manipulate you if you could see certain things or read certain things about a person. So, Zach, welcome back to the show. Now, just to start off with, and of course, for those who didn't catch our earlier episodes, we really went into some detail breaking down some of the pseudoscience and grifting nonsense that goes on in the YouTube world around body language analysis. But today's show is going to be more on the actual methods and knowledge of this. So to start off with here in terms of your credentials, you've written 3 books on this topic. Yeah?
Yeah, specifically on poker tells, and I like to emphasize that it's a specific domain with specific contexts, but we can get more into that. But yeah, I've written 3 books on poker tells and have a video series on poker tells. Yeah.
Right. And I think that right off with you stressing that difference in these contexts and domains, this is, of course, I'm all about that because it's not, there's very, very, very few things about people that are universally true, right? Just because somebody raises their eyebrow this way, or just because I do that doesn't mean if you do that same thing that it means the same thing, that we intend or are, that eyebrow raise is because we are feeling the same way about something. There could be a million reasons for somebody to do that. So right off, we see the variation in people. So what is it that we are making claims about or thinking about when it comes to body language and tells? Where's the line drawn here? What are we saying is possible versus the sort of ridiculous stuff?
Yeah, and I want to say thanks for having me on. I know we've had some good discussions, and I always like coming on here because it does force me to think through my ideas a little bit more. So it's a good prompt and pressure for me to think through some of these things. But
awesome.
Yeah, I think, one of the things I like to emphasize and that I've realized after, being in this space for many years, I wrote my first Poker Tells book in 2012. I started my podcast in 2018, I think it was. And so I thought a lot about how to make use of behavior and how it plays out in different domains. Like I've interviewed a lot of people who talk about using behavior in different domains. And I think, my big realization over the years is just how different this space is when you compare the game space from the non-game / real world space. I think the fact that, for example, I think that it's very hard to make use of reading behavior in practical terms in real world non-game situations like interrogations, interviews, what have you. I think it's still difficult, but much more possible to do that in game scenarios because you have these very minute, discrete situations that come up. It's a very formalized environment with very, much fewer factors at work. It's not about deception detection. It's more about like sensing levels of relaxation or people being focused or not focused in different spots. not to say it's easy, but to say that it's much easier to get practical uses of it in the game slash sports domain. I think there's many reasons for that, but that's a big realization for me, which helps explain why, for example, many people are surprised that I have written books on poker tells, and I regularly, am skeptical and scoff at a lot of these so-called behavior experts who I think are selling a lot of hogwash. But that view of the different domains and how different those domains are helps explain that, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So how do you define reading behavior when it comes to real world, like, let's get nuts and bolts about this now. What is it? How do you think about it?
Yeah, I think we should start out too with it might be good to say the word behavior is such a wide scope of things. Like, it's basically at some level, it's everything humans do and say, right? Like, so, and it's everything from the really granular things like body language, small things, or small verbal patterns, all the way up to the macro level, meta level things of many things people are doing and saying that could be conceived of as patterns. So just to say the ambiguity in the term itself can make it hard to talk about, because, if you say, like, it's hard to make practical use of behavior, if you say something like that in real world situations, it's difficult. People are like, no, we use behavior, we're reading behavior all the time. And it's like, it ties into the need to be granular with what we're talking about and what specific domains and what specific behaviors we're talking about. But for your question of, how do we think about reading behavior in real world practical terms? I mean, that's kind of been for my podcast the theme of it, because I think when you see people making claims about using something, say reading behavior, reading nonverbal behavior, reading body language, reading facial expressions, and making use of it, you should immediately wonder, for that or for any claims of practical use, you should immediately ask to see, well, what are the practical real world examples, that you or other people are having in this space? And I think the fact is, when you look into, say, people that have written books on reading behavior for, law enforcement or business or negotiation purposes, the fact of the matter is, you read these books and you're just very hard pressed to find real world examples of, like, how this would actually make a difference, right? You'll find, I mean, like, I'll give you an example. I was recently rereading Joe Navarro's book, a former FBI agent who's quite well known in the space, and not to throw him under the bus, I think he's one of the more responsible people working, writing on that topic out there. But rereading his book, I was struck by, like, how few practical examples there were in the book of, like, you would think he would have a lot of examples throughout a career of doing that, right? But the fact of the matter is, you read these books and you just don't find those examples. And I think that's for a very good reason, is because it's just extremely hard to use this very highly ambiguous and high variance kind of information to do practical things with. Whereas I think, getting back to the game versus non-game scenarios, I think there's a multitude of reasons why that kind of thing is much more useful and actionable in the game space. It's why, for example, I could walk you through examples of, me and others using tells in the real world, and why we did that and why that was a good decision. I just think the amount of examples like that in the real world non-game scenarios is much harder to find, and there's a good reason for that. Yeah.
Well, fair enough. Absolutely. I think that maybe for the audience, let's narrow this into a really broad way of thinking about it that I'm approaching this with, and maybe you'll agree with me. I think we're looking at our estimation of what's unusual behavior in somebody else, and using that to try to tell or navigate or make assumptions about how do we interpret that unusual behavior. And I think that this is applicable to every single person out there. When we see children, for example, who are trying to get one over on their parents, and the parents notice just something off, wait a second, something's a little off in the way my kid's talking to me right now. And maybe that's all they get at first, but they sense a little something, and then they, okay, wait a minute, let me look into this, let me investigate this. And of course, with children, it's wonderful because their excuses fall apart in, minutes because they haven't really thought the thought through. But they're trying trying to deceive, and it's those little unusual little hiccups that come out in the behavior, in their manner of speaking, in the words they're using, in the way they stand, in the way they're, in the way they hold their arms. Suddenly you can see they're more self-conscious about their posture. Just these little subtle things that you go, wait a second. And it's that little bell ringing, I think, that we're talking about here today, or at least the things that would set that little bell off. And the fact that some people make exaggerated claims about what those things mean, which I think you and I have talked about at length. But now we want to talk about, well, how do we use that? What is there to be mined and found versus what is just guesswork and pure conjecture, right? And that's where I think we really find those lines between, well, the right eyebrow raised always means X, Y, Z. Well, hang on, right? But I think my big take on this is that, but if you know Joe or Bill or Sally, and you know how they act usually, then the unusual would come out more quickly. You would be able to actually more accurately or more, correctly be able to guess at what's going on over here, right, with this person versus, here's this set of rules I'm going to write down on a piece of paper, and this is going to apply to everybody. If they cross their right leg, it means this. If they cross their left leg, it means this. Right. So that's kind of what I'm thinking. What do you think about all that?
Well, I think, it gets into why these things are hard to talk about because I believe, there are many, clues around us behaviorally, verbally, small clues all around us about the things that people are thinking. The example of a kid, being easy to read by their parents is a good example. They're unsophisticated, so they're rather obvious in their, behavior or their verbal patterns, things they say. And I think that also, I think these things abound all around us. I think we're constantly reading little clues every day to navigate situations. So I think this is why it can be hard to talk about, because you or I are not denying that. But I think we are saying and I should add, I mean, I read Freud's, what was it? The psychopathology of everyday life, I think is the title, where he has all these very minute examples of things people say, which many of them are very interesting. And I think still are interesting things to think about, how people phrase things and little clues in their wording. I think he's over the top, to be clear. But this is just to say, I've always found it interesting. I mean, that's why I got into poker tells. I find behavior very interesting. But I think, there's a difference between that and actually like making use of things in a general, one size fits all. Getting to your point about I think that the difficulty in real world non-game scenarios like interrogations, interviews, what have you, the fundamental difficulty is that someone can be anxious, nervous, can feel strange for a wide variety of reasons. And so trying to get clues about discomfort and to use that in some sort of way to think that they're, that this means they're deceiving or that they have something to hide is where a lot of it goes astray, because in high stakes scenarios like an interrogation, right, or, similar scenarios, there's just many reasons why you can feel uncomfortable. And the idea that you're going to get some useful behavior from these scenarios is just in the real world sense, just very, very hard to do. And I think that is what boils down to it, because, you or I might make all sorts of observations about people and why they're doing that. And some of those observations might be reliable. Like, for example, I found Chris Watts's, the guy who murdered his family. I found his behavior and the things he said very interesting. I found a lot of clues there. But that's a good example. Even if I was in the moment, I still would have found the fundamental evidence much more the much more pertinent thing to focus on. And it's like, what would I even have done even if I thought his behavior was suspicious? Usually you're getting all the information from the real world things anyway, even if you find somebody's behavior suspicious. So it's just to say that's why you're hard pressed to find examples in the real world where these things apply, even if you have your own vibes and feelings about, I think that's why he's doing these things or why he's saying these things, right? Yeah. So hopefully that gets it more precise about where it can be hard to make practical use of it, even if we do have our various thoughts about why people are doing and saying things.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I think we've made it pretty clear at this point and, kind of set the stage here that it's complicated, nuanced, and, not so black and white. It's not so like, okay, it's always this or it's always this. So great. So people listening to this are like, okay, great. So this is hard and it's bad. It's hard to do and it's complicated. But actually, we all do it every day. And I think that's kind of been another thing we've also been sort of talking about here is we read each other all day, every day, because that's called empathy and compassion and getting along with people. As you read them, you see them, you interpret what they're doing. But we're talking about.
I would throw in, Chris, another interesting thing about getting into reading these books on behavior.
Yeah,
there's also just a lot of like common sense stuff where you'll read it in the reviews on like Amazon reviews for some of these books. It's like most of the stuff in here is like completely common sense. And so it's a combination of a lot of common sense stuff combined with like a lack of real world examples of how you would actually use a lot of this stuff. So I just want to throw that in there. It's like, yeah, you and I and others are using a lot of these things every day for navigating, you get a sense, for example, that like a room you're talking to is disinterested because they're looking at their watch or shuffling around or like looking at the door, right? We're always navigating like, oh, I think someone's not really interested in what I'm saying, or you're getting a vibe one way or another. Yeah.
Exactly. And we call that common sense, but what we really mean in this context is the things everybody knows, about how to read somebody. So it's not like this. I guess I just wanted to put that out there because I want everybody to know you're already doing this. It's not like there's some, post grad level skill set to be learned here, but there is, again, what we're going to talk about, right, is a little bit more granular, a little bit more context specific, a little bit more nuanced about this stuff, right? So that's why we're going so far out of our way to like, talk about this, there's nuance. Because the guys who grift on this stuff don't ever say this stuff. And maybe that's why we're, going so overboard with it. Now, that being all said, what do we see at this exact line, this exact point of observing the behavior, interpreting the behavior? What's the difference there? What's happening?
I observe a lot of behavior. I would say it's much more rare for me to interpret it. For example, just this morning I've been doing this. If we're talking about the game area specifically, just this morning I was doing this consult with this high stakes poker player. He plays in some very high stakes games, and once a week or so we watch footage, and we watched footage of some streams of poker that include some of his regular opponents, and we hide the whole cards and turn the commentary off so we can watch it blind. We just focus on nonverbal behavior and try to interpret things. And so I'm observing constantly, but it's only seldom that I'll say like, oh, I'm guessing that his hand strength is one way or another based on X, Y, Z. So it's one thing to observe. Observing, is great. I think it's another thing to actually put yourself out there and like go out on a limb and say, I'm going to interpret this and make a guess as to its meaning. Right. That takes more risk, right? Especially depending on the situation. Like obviously, some situations are more minor than others, like playing a minor board game and basing a decision on somebody's behavior is very minor compared to like a high stakes poker game or basing a decision in a high stakes, murder investigation or something. So I think, I don't know if that's what you were asking, but I do think it is important to emphasize that, observing and trying to find patterns is different than actually making some interpretation or some prediction about what that means.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to separate those two things because I think it's two different acts, and yet people can kind of mush them into one and not see that one follows the other. And first is observation, then interpretation. And if you're jumping right to interpretation, well, we call that assumption, and that would be wrong. So, there's a higher chance, of course, because you're really literally just guessing if you're not first observing. I bring this up interestingly. I think the ex-Scientologists in my audience will tune in on this one a little harder because it's a thing in Scientology that Hubbard even coined a word for this. He called it obnosis. He called it, and it was something we would practice because obnosis was observing the obvious. It was an exercise we would do to train ourselves to see what was in front of us and not make assumptions about it. If you got a chair, and an example would be if you have a chair in front of you, well, you assume it has four legs, but how many do you actually observe? You observe three. You don't see the fourth leg. You assume it's there, but when you're telling the coach, the person who's doing the exercise with you, well, what do you see? And they go, oh, well, I see a chair with legs. Oh, how many? Well, it's got four. Oh, do you see four? Well, no, I only see three. That differentiation is where I'm talking about of, that kind of a difference.
So Hubbard had a good exercise there.
Yeah, well, he did, and this is one of those things where you find these sort of simple, practical exercises that have some kind of utility, but it's not some secret sauce Scientology
right.
has.
It's just good logical deduction or observation. Yeah,
exactly. He probably cribbed it from the military or something, honestly, because they have all kinds of observation drills in the military for stuff. But I bring this point up to, not only, sort of clarify my question, but also highlight this point that it's going to be awful hard to do the interpretation if you're not accurately and sort of mindfully doing the observation. And you, as a professional poker player, of course, are doing this at the level of let's cut the noise, let's cut the audio, let's cut, the commentary, let's just watch this video at silently and observe what we observe, right? That's exactly the sort of thing I'm describing that we would do in Scientology, and it does tune it up a little bit,
And the fact that the interesting thing in poker and other games too is you can quickly get a result about like whether you were right or not, which I think has no, in these little micro events that come up, somebody bet. What do they have? The fact that you can get very clear results and more data. Obviously, it can be noisy data, but it can be much more data driven than like, there's no correlation to that, to like an interrogation room. Like, the way they're acting, you're never going to get a clear knowledge of, what it was due to, even if they end up being guilty or innocent. There's just it's much noisier is what I'm trying to say, versus like somebody's bluffing or value betting in a very polarized big bet spot. And then you get to see them act a certain way in multiple similar spots, and you can compare those spots quite easily.
That's right.
Yeah, that's just exactly. To say it's more data observation. It's more conducive to careful observation, I think. Yeah.
I agree. And I think that, in fact, you've made this point a couple of times, so let's dive into it now, which is this differentiation between normal, average, low stakes, no stakes situations versus, the adrenaline's going. Okay, now the nervous system is in a different state. You could have the 4 F's coming in, right? Fight, flight, fawn, freeze. You could have, in other words, a hypervigilant state. The person is super hyper aware and hyper focused for some reason. In a poker game, obviously, they're going to be focused on their cards and what's going on around the table. You could probably parade in, a stream of monkeys and Playboy models or something around the room, and the people at the table wouldn't even notice. Right? They're just like so focused on what's going on at the table. Right? I exaggerate.
Yeah, for sure.
You
Yeah,
know,
for sure.
it's that old video about, you know, the basketball court and
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
that's right.
The guy in the gorilla suit walking through
Yes,
the yeah, that's what I was
that's right.
thinking
Like
too. Yeah.
90% of people don't see that, right? They just
Yeah.
totally don't. They just totally don't see it.
It's
So
especially true for the more degenerate poker players. Just kidding. That's
yes,
just a little bit.
exactly. So we can see. I'm obviously throwing out here, right, that there's these times, these contexts when things matter. There are stakes. There's something on the line, right? And when that happens, our nervous system changes its state. We are more aware, more focused, more on, right? And this is the time when you are trying to read another person. And now in poker, they're in a place where they're trying to not let you know how they're feeling too. So
Right.
they're actively defending their body language, not just passively sitting there unguarded. They are guarded. And this is where we can draw those parallels between a poker game and a police interrogation. There's similarities, even though, you know, in a poker game, no matter how much money's on the line, it's going to be pretty rare that it's going to matter as much as when you're in a police interrogation and your life is on the line. But at the same time, there are times when it does come to that kind of stakes, right?
Well, yeah, I think they're really hard to compare. I mean, it's tough because there's these specific formal dynamic things that happen in, you know, formal situations in poker where only a few factors are involved. And I should add too, it's not just the big, you know, the big spots where you can get tells. Like you can get tells early in a hand based on like, you know, somebody doesn't seem that interested, focused in their hand, and it's like, well, that's for your average player, that's going to mean they don't have that big a hand because they would probably be a little bit more focused on the hand. These little things like that. So just to say, there can be like small pot reads, there can be big pot reads when somebody's betting and might have a polarization of emotion and such. But I think it's hard to draw the analogies to like an interrogation. Like even though a lot may be on the line, there's not this, you know, assumed competitive situation. There's not these specific events that they're doing, like they're answering questions or telling stories. They're not trying to like do some specific action and like hoping that the interrogator does something or doesn't do something. Like, you
Sure.
know, there's not these like spikes of events that happen, right? So that's one thing that makes it difficult to compare. I think there's some things that map over, but I do think, you know, and just as in, you know, games and non-games are different. I think it's also important to get back to there's differences between types of games. Like I'm really cautious about taking my poker knowledge and applying it to a different game or a sport because the context and factors can be so different. Like I'll say too, like I think not to throw Joe Navarro under the bus too much, but he had written that book about general behavior, and then he tried to write a poker tells book, which I thought was very bad. Like Joe Navarro admits he's not even a poker player, but he was just trying to take these general behaviors over to the poker world. And there were just things he said that were completely opposite of the general patterns because, you know, he was trying to take, I'll give you a summary.
Yeah.
He was trying to take these general anxiety tells, like say self-soothing, like rubbing your neck or like, rubbing your temple or these kinds of self-soothing things, which, you know, makes sense that maybe somebody who's uncomfortable in an interrogation might do. And he was trying to say like, oh, these are signs of anxiety in a poker game. But the truth is, you'll basically never see a bluffer give away indicators that they're anxious like that. Like you won't see a bluffer being like, "Oh man, I'm really I'm really worried about this." It's actually the opposite, right? Like bluffers have an incentive to not do those things because everybody mostly knows what those signs of self-soothing mean, you know. Mm-hmm. So if it's actually a sign that somebody has a strong hand when they're going like, oh man, what should I do? You know, oh geez, what, you know, or have those expressions of uncertainty or like self-soothing. So, you know, when that behavior is associated with a big bet. But, you know, so just to say, like, I actually wrote an article saying like Joe has completely screwed this up. Like he shouldn't have written this book. He admits to not even being a poker player. So to me, it's like, and so that getting back to why I'm very cautious, like, I wouldn't have talked about this stuff years ago because it took me quite a while of thinking about it before I got to a place of being like, oh, I see where there's some similarities in some different domains. I see where there's major differences. I think it's a mistake a lot of people make, not just in behavior, but thinking that their knowledge applies outside of a domain because they've seen it
Oh,
apply in their domain, right?
oh gosh, all the time. See that all the time. It's a big problem all the way to the top of our socioeconomic ladder. So,
Yep.
um, so you're making a good point there, right? A number of good points, in fact, about the differences there. And I was only trying to draw some parallels in terms of the, just a heightened state of nervous system, all
Mm,
that kind of stuff. I think as we went over, but you're absolutely right that there are all these differences too, and the fact that the skill set involved with this is another difference, right, between poker and police interrogations. We're not going to really do a whole compare and contrast here today, but just to bring these differences up, because in a poker situation with professional or semi-pro guys people playing, um, they're habituated, thousands and thousands of hands played to keeping their keeping their cards to the chest, close to the chest, as they say, right? Whereas in a police interrogation, most people who walk into a police interrogation, that's the first time they've ever been in that room. They haven't had thousands of interrogations. Had they had that much experience with it, they'd probably be able to go give a master class in how to deceive the police in a police interrogation, right? But that wouldn't necessarily play over to how to deceive fellow poker players at a poker table. They're
right.
different contexts at the end of the day, for sure.
Hmm.
And and I think context really, really, really matters. Another silly example might be that at a poker table, you're going to be looking for certain things, and you're going to, as a player, be trying to suppress or hide certain things. In a chess game, it's high stakes. There could be money on the line, but the need to deceive and the need to not give any tells or anything during a chess game is a very, very different thing. Nobody cares because you're not hiding anything. Everything's on the board.
But I
The
tell
next
you,
move,
so
right?
this might be interesting. Yeah, the
Yeah,
another major difference between games, well, most games and real world interrogation kind of scenarios is in poker. There's an assumed deception element of like I'm trying to fool you and get you to think I have the opposite of my hand
that's right.
strength. There's no
That's
real
right.
equivalent to that in an interrogation. Like somebody, an innocent person being questioned isn't thinking like I'm gonna make him think I'm guilty or something. Like there's just no. I mean, a guilty person
No,
might
I
be.
think I
You know,
think that I think the analogy probably comes in where in an interrogation room, whether you're trying, when you're sitting at the receiving end of questions, you're trying to sell the police a story.
mhm. You're trying to imitate an innocent person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You're
So
trying
there.
to
Yeah.
give them the impression you want them to walk away, go, this guy, not a suspect, absolutely innocent.
Yeah.
And in a poker table, you want them thinking, oh, this guy's got nothing. He's a lose, this is a losing
Yeah,
hand. He's
you want to
definitely
sell the story via
that's
your
right.
actions or otherwise that you're the opposite
That's
of
right.
the way you are. But I did say I want to say even in chess, obviously it's a game of complete information. But even there, like a player wouldn't want to stare too much at a certain area of the board where they might
Well,
be thinking
true.
about, right? So that just to say,
True.
like even in chess, there are some interesting things where you might be like,
That's
I
true.
don't want to look at that area that I know might really be important, right? So
That's right.
yeah,
Especially
yeah.
in the over the board, because on the online you don't have to
Oh,
worry
on
about any of that. But
yeah,
but
yeah.
oh, but in real life, oh man, right? And I guess it would be somewhat similar now that I brought the online component up. I guess it would be somewhat similar in online poker too. You wouldn't have any of that
Yeah,
tell
yeah,
stuff.
yeah. I don't know how much you want to talk about specific reads in poker, but I will say like the bet timing, like the more immediate actions can be quite the whole timing area is like one of the most important tells areas about like how calling or checking or betting. It's the more immediate actions, but yeah, the timing can be quite meaningful, and that's obviously the main thing that you would have in online poker or other online games because you wouldn't see people, so it would just almost entirely the bet timing. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, that's another great segue into nonverbal versus verbal cues and whatnot, right? Because there's a here's I'm gonna lead with this one with a real blunt like question, right? Which is how important are the nonverbal versus verbal in terms of, you know, you have watched thousands and thousands of hands played. So you've watched over and over and over again people trying to sell a story, and then did they pull it off or not? Right? And you're trying to sell your own story. Did you pull it off or not? What can you say about that in terms of what are the things that are actually important to know
Yes.
versus the things you'd go, you know what, you could not know about that and it wouldn't change a thing, you know?
Well, yeah, it would be good to emphasize. I mean, I emphasize in my work that tells are a very small part of poker, even live poker, and that's something. I think that's, you know, the fact that my work is as respected as it is due to writing in a realistic way about poker tells. Like, I'm not claiming like this is gonna turn you from a winning player or a losing player to a winning player. I'm not claiming you'll be able to often read people. So I make it very clear that, like, for example, like say I play an average, you know, day long session, 8 to 10 hour session, I might only use a behavior to shift a decision, like, you know, once, twice, three times, maybe. And some of that might even be like small decisions early in a hand, like thinking somebody's less focused than usual, like I mentioned, and like raising them, you know, when I wouldn't have otherwise, or something like this. So just to say, and I go out of my way in my work to say, like, you know, if you're a winning poker player, which you should be already if you're even thinking about tells, otherwise it wouldn't be a good idea for you to spend much time on it unless you're a winning poker player. But if you're a winning poker player, becoming a good reader of tells might add, like, you know, anywhere from 1 to 15% to your win rate, right? Like the amount you win. So we're not talking game changing, and you could be a strategic fundamental strategy is so much more important. Like, you could be a huge winning poker player and only think about strategy and never think about tells. And many players are like that. Like, many players never think about tells, and that's completely fine. I think I think people would say, you know, I and others would say, you know, you're just leaving some money on the table that you could have or avoid losing if you keyed a little bit more into that, especially some of the more, like, even just learning some of the more obvious things, let alone like the more obscure things. I think would add a good amount to an average player's win rate. So just to say, yeah, I think that helps put it in context. And this is why it's like, it's so hard to use, even in poker. It's so rare to make a practical or, you know, base a decision on that. And then then it becomes even more hard when you get into like real world, more complex spots that are much more ambiguous, and it's a much more wide open playing field basically in the real world. But I don't know if that answers your question, or I could go into more detail on some part of it.
That was a great answer, because what it does is it makes me wonder immediately about, okay, so 1 to 15% you're sort of thrown out there as a guesstimate of how often tells and physicality and reading signs is going to make any kind of a difference in your play or your decision making. Did I get that right? Did I understand that?
Well, it's more like it's that they're two different things. You might occasionally change a decision based on a read, like a handful or less times a session. But I was saying, you know, say your average win rate is like, you know, for a professional poker player is like you're winning like, I don't know, you know, $2,000 a week. Being a good reader of tells might add like up to 15% to that win rate. So it was two different ways to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah. But no matter how you slice it, it's a relatively small thing compared to, you know, focusing on strong fundamental strategy.
Well, and that was where I was going, is what in terms of focusing on the fundamental strategy, perhaps one reason why people jump to the body language and the tells and everything is because they don't know, and it's not obvious what is the fundamental strategy of poker. To most people, it looks like you get a random set of cards, you make a couple choices, you get some more random cards. Good luck. You know, so if you don't know how to fool people, you're screwed, and they're just going to walk all over you, right? So,
No, yeah.
what is the actual thinking on this?
No, you've got to. You actually make a really good point. I think there's a good map over to why, for example, like I've sold a good number of poker tells books because behavior is sexy. Like, let's be honest, people, just in the same way that all these people who I think are dishonest grifters have sold many books, I've sold probably more books than I deserve, because even though I go out of my way to say, hey, you probably shouldn't be reading this unless you're a winning poker player, people are really interested in like these shortcuts to reading people. Like, they think, that's what a lot of this stuff boils down to, is they want shortcuts. They don't want to actually learn how to play poker. Poker is an extremely complex game, especially no limit poker, right? It's much harder to solve than chess. Even like if you look up programs trying to solve from a game theory optimal perspective, solve no limit hold'em, for example, it's much more complex than chess. So this is just to say that people do want these shortcuts, whether it's poker shortcuts or whether it's like real life. I want advantages over other people in the business or law enforcement or therapy realm or whatever it may be. I want advantages. I want shortcuts. And so I think there is something about the reading people being a tempting shortcut that I think I mean, it's why I owe a lot of I've sold more than 48,000 books, poker books, and that's a lot of that is because people are wrongly, I'll be honest, they're wrongly valuing this stuff when they should be focusing on learning actual poker strategy, right?
Well, it's and with the chess analogy, right? It's like you can beat your head against a wall playing that game. I certainly have enough recently, but until you play it over and over and over again, the patterns don't start emerging, right? And that's the frustration, I think, when we're beginners, is we don't even recognize that patterns exist or that they're there, right?
Poker is a deceptively simple looking game, right? It looks very simple, but it's immensely complex. Like thinking about how to be balanced in these various spots and to come up with a strategy that is going to be foundationally strong, that is balanced, as they say, in many spots. People who are interested in that, just look up game theory optimal approaches to beating poker, and you'll see how complex it is. But in a similar way, like the people that watch, like the behavior panel or follow Chase Hughes, they think they can get these shortcuts to, right. Like I tell people when they ask me, well, what should I study for understanding behavior when it comes to reading people in these, real world situations? And I say, you shouldn't pay attention to the nonverbal stuff at all. You should just focus on, studying how people make logical deductions about what people have said. Like, are there stories adding up? Do what they say make sense? Are there logical deductions you can make about the things they've actually said? And I think those kinds of things are so underrated. But like the things that people are telling us are full of so much information. It's such a more information rich source than nonverbal behavior, and they're telling us things, and sometimes they're trying to deceive us, and that can play out in how they speak to us. They move away from the main point, or they bring in unnecessary details. And so, it's just to say that that's a much more information rich source of information. Yeah.
Right. And I think maybe we're taking a page a little bit from neurolinguistic programming when we say, well, it's not only what people say, but how they say it, and the words with which they chose to say it might indicate some kind of where they're at. But of course, we're not trying to make strong conclusions about every time somebody starts talking about colors or the word blue, they're off in anxiety land or something. I mean, people have made dumbass connections like that, and I don't think we're trying to say that. But what sort of things do you see there? You mentioned a couple generalized kind of examples. Give us some more of what you're looking for when you're reading somebody's words, or how they're talking, or what they're saying.
Yeah, I think there's a spectrum of things there. There's things like, there's things all the way down to these granular little patterns of how people say things, which, if people are interested in that, Mark McClish wrote this book, I Know You Are Lying, where it's about statement analysis. And I think a lot of that stuff holds water. Like, people, it's not to say that I would base like major decisions or, no, I think with all these things, we have to remember these things can vary. So like to try to reach some conclusion that, a suspect has said a few of these verbal patterns and therefore I'm confident they're guilty is a mistake. But I do think, we can still say we think a lot of these patterns might hold water. Whether how actionable they are is another story. But just to say, I was a fan of Mark McClish's book. I Know You Are Lying. I think it has a lot of real world map over to real world uses. I see a lot of the patterns he talks about in real life. And it was actually, that book was actually what inspired me to write Verbal Poker Tells. And I spent 8 months studying verbal patterns in poker, like including, I watched, hundreds of, maybe not hundreds, maybe like 100 hours of footage or something like that. Or probably more than that, maybe 200, something like that. And then I played a lot, took a lot of notes. But his book about these granular little patterns about how people word things, I thought was very interesting. I think a lot of that stuff is present in poker, is present in a lot of domains. But then we have things like that up to like more meta level things of just what the content of what somebody says. Like, I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
Might be, talking about Epstein stuff can be challenging. But I'll say one thing I had a deduction of, and this is just an example of, I think of things that I think are much more valuable that have to do with logical deductions of what people say, much more valuable than, talking about behavior and such. But I don't know if you saw that, like Brett Ratner, there was the director, Brett Ratner, had a picture of him hanging out with a young girl with Jeffrey Epstein in the photo. Both of them had their arms around what looked like a young girl. You couldn't tell because their faces were, covered. The girls' faces were covered. But people were like, oh, Brett Ratner's, one of these people. He's done horrible things with Epstein. And Brett Ratner made a statement about it and said, he said, that was my fiance at the time. And everybody was like, sure, that was your fiance. We don't believe you, blah, 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 all these comments, But I immediately thought that Brett Ratner was telling the truth. And the reason was because if he was going to lie about something, he would just say it was a girlfriend of mine. Like, he wouldn't be specific and say something that was actually much easier to fact check, right? Like, you could presumably go back and check, like, at that time, people would know who Brett Ratner's fiance was, right? So to me, it was an immediate thing of deducing, like, he's telling the truth, I think. Like, I would bet a good amount of money that he's telling the truth. Because if he was, more specific language is often a sign that someone, it has less to hide, because if they were deceiving, they would choose more ambiguous language. So just to say, like, little deductions, and I haven't looked into whether I'm right or not. That was just a deduction I made, whether I was right or not. But it's just to say, like, I think those kinds of deductions are much more valuable, and learning how to make those quick deductions in the moment, like you're doing an interrogation, or you're doing like a visa application, or, overseeing a visa application as a, an embassy worker or something, like learning how to make those quick deductions and then follow it up with fitting questions, right? I think that's a much more useful thing to focus on than like, oh, he looked down and like looked nervous when I said that. That's just craziness to focus on that stuff when you have so much more information about what they're actually saying, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think this goes just to keep, because it's kind of fun to do it. I just keep thinking about those police interrogations. And I just, because of course we all see them in the police procedurals and stuff, right? And that's not necessarily how they really go as how they show them on TV, by the way. Those things are highly fictionalized. But in real life, and I am talking about real life when I'm talking about police interrogations today. We're not talking about the, Law and Order. I was thinking Crime and Punishment.
Yeah. Although there's also an interesting selection bias with things we see on YouTube about even the real interrogations, because we see such a small snapshot of the actual interrogation. So people are like, oh, that was really interesting what he did. This tells us so much about interrogations. I'm like, no, this is just one weird outlier that happened to get a lot of attention, right? So
Exactly.
there can be many ways that like we are led astray by biases.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go. Is I wanted to ask you, how do you guard yourself against confirmation bias, against your own? Because you, as a pro, you're going to start expecting to see things, or thinking, well, X goes to Z most of the time. So, so you see X, you start looking for Z. But sometimes we can see it when it's not there. Right. And that's what we call that confirmation bias, where we expect to see it and we make it look like it's there when it's really not. this is a very, very big problem with people, right? Very
Yeah,
big
for sure.
problem.
No, it's yeah,
When specificity,
that's a tough one.
when exactitude matters, when it really is an important decision, then it's harder than you think. So, how do you take this up in your books or in your approach with your work?
Yeah, I think I mean there's getting back to the different contexts, it's like obviously in interrogation investigation kind of spots, it's a different kind of high stakes situation. Like you wouldn't it's one thing to base like a even a high stakes decision in poker on a read because like it's not that horrible if you're wrong, but like it's another thing entirely to affect someone's life negatively based on a read, right? Which does happen sometimes. People get weird ideas in their head about he's definitely guilty. So I think
Right.
I think the thing that ties the areas together about using information well and avoiding confirmation bias, I think is you just have to start out. You always have to remember that you're going to often be wrong. Like your instincts will often be wrong. And confirmation bias is a real thing. So you always have to be remembering. You have like for example, you have to try to remember the times you were wrong, and because confirmation bias means that you will often be tempted to forget the times you were wrong. So
Exactly.
when you were and I found myself in Poker Tells world way back in the day before I even started writing the first book, when I was playing poker, I thought I was a much better reader of people than I was. Like it took years of being like, oh, I've been wrong in that spot, many times, and it got rid of these ideas, and also working through the ideas for the book, forced me to grapple with them more logically and think about them more in depth. But you just really have to fight against the confirmation bias that tells you like that you're good at something, that tells you that you have a lot of knowledge about something, because often you'll have much less knowledge and about these various spots than you think, and you have to be open to the idea that you could be falling prey to confirmation bias. So yeah, you have to really focus on the times you were wrong and think about why you were wrong, and not just let it brush over it and say like, oh, that was just an anomaly, nothing to see there, which I think is what happens to people, like I'd say that happens to even people that are respected researchers like Paul Ekman, who brush over all the research that goes against his
Yes.
own theories.
Yes.
I think he and other people, it's tempting to think you're a genius and to think like I really know what's going on because I'm so experienced. So I
Right.
think you just have to embrace a lot of humility and recognize that even people much more knowledgeable than you in whatever domain are probably frequently making mistakes, and you have to really embrace that humility. And I think that's the nice thing about poker is to become a winning poker player, you really have to let go of your ego, not just from the, forgetting the behavior stuff, but just to become a winning poker player strategically. Because there's so many strategies that just, to become a winning player, you have to go against a lot of instincts you have about how to approach the game. And you have to be open
Mm.
to, I could be, you have to be open to the fact that you have to be continually improving and questioning your instincts and saying, is this really right? Is there a better strategic approach that is more scalable, that will be right in more spots? But yeah, I think answer your question, I think it gets really down to being willing to embrace that humility, to embrace the times you're wrong and see what you can learn from them, to avoid being 100% certain about anything, because I think that's where the bad outcomes happen in the real world, like investigative scenarios where people are so overly certain based on bad behavioral information or bad other information, they start negatively impacting other people's lives. So I think it's more responsible for you, and it's more responsible for the world to embrace that humility. Yeah.
Well, exactly. And I think you said something really practical and helpful there, which when you said, remember all the times you were wrong. That's a great little tip right there, right? Because we all, oh yeah, no, I could be wrong. And then we make the bad mistake anyway, right? It's like, no, 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 no. actually remember all the times you were wrong, because it's almost one of these like, psychic reading kind of things where you could actually hash mark, the little four line, the 5 line thing. Anyway, where you could keep track of how many times the psychic was wrong in her, 20-minute reading, and then the one or two things that she gets right. And you go, because they were just pure guesses out of, 50 claims that were made in your direction. You walk out of there only remembering 2 of them.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But if you could remember that she was wrong 48 times and only right 2, it really puts it in a little bit more perspective and gives you that humility that you were talking about, because it's right front and center there. You can't deny it. We're really bad at numbers and thinking that way. So I just throw it out there as another tip, but I think I think you're making a really important point there. One second. I had another thing I wanted to ask you about on that. Oh, that's it. In fact, I'll go so far as to say, tell me what you think about this as somebody who trains others, works with others too. It almost is a thing where if you're trying to get good at something, until you start feeling imposter syndrome, you haven't really gotten anywhere yet.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the whole Dunning-Kruger thing of realize, the more time you spend in an area, the more complex you start realizing it is. And I've said that in poker before. Like, poker is such a complex space, especially with the last, decade plus of people doing more solving of it from a game theory optimal perspective. Like, the more time I spent playing poker, the more I was like, I don't know anything. Like, you see, it was like my estimate of my own knowledge just kept going down over time, not up,
Right.
So, I mean, that's a real thing, especially, then you add in like the complete, and that's a game with very formal rules. Then you add in the complexity of the real world, which is a wide open environment with no real rules. Right. So, just to say, yeah, we should be very humble about our ability to understand many things, I think.
Yeah, well, exactly. It really does apply across the boards, and it's just one of those things where you realize that because we have ego and because we have social standing and reputation considerations, we're always so, no, I know it, I know everything, I know all about it, right? Trying to sell ourselves to other people rather than just own that we're kind of morons. And there's a couple things in our life we get to specialize in and know a little bit more than everybody else.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, I think I'm a moron about something like at least once a week. Maybe that's more frequent than is healthier, but
Yo, absolutely. So about 3 times a day, man. I just feel like a
I
complete
could have gone
doofus.
higher.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a little higher than once a week, maybe.
Yeah. Well, now I have another question, and it really is like in the poker world. I think this would be a really good sort of thing, which is we talk about, and you and I have agreed, that if you don't know somebody or know their baseline, know their average, know what their regular behavior is, then it's impossible for you to sit there and say, well, this person wouldn't normally do X, Y, or Z, cross their arms this way, raise their eyebrows this way, because you don't even know them. So how would you know? So yet in a poker situation, you can end up in a room with people you don't know. You've never met them there until you got there tonight, right? So how reliable is this knowledge then, and what's valuable about knowing tells or body language stuff at that point when it's just a room of strangers you're playing against?
Yeah, you and I talked about this a bit, like the whole idea of baselining. I mean, I think it's a legitimate idea, but I think in the real world, especially in non-game scenarios, like the idea of baselining someone is, to me, absurd. Like the idea that you're gonna get some sense of how someone, say in an interrogation scenario, that you're gonna get some sense of like how they're responding when they're relaxed, or how they're responding when they're deceptive, or how they're and being able to separate all the factors at work. The idea that you could do that even in like a multi-day span, to me, is ridiculous. And the idea, I think you and I have talked about it, but the idea, the fact that the alleged behavior experts talk about baselining so much is to kind of obscure the fact that this stuff is nearly impossible to make practical use of. So they can always be like, well, you didn't baseline enough if you didn't get the right results, or,
That's
it makes it sound more legitimate. But yeah, so getting into how that applies to the poker world, I would say yeah, sometimes you do play with regular players, especially if you're, especially if you're a frequent poker player. You can get reads of people over time and develop those reads, and like
sure.
people keep notes on regular opponents and such, and that is a real thing. But in general, I'd say the most of the useful tells that I act on are just tells that are true for a general population. Like, for example, you know, the fact that there's certain behaviors, players who are very relaxed and have a big hand and that they're betting, there's certain behaviors that bluffers are just very unlikely to do in those situations, like have very loose behavior, like looking around very loosely with their eyes. Usually a bluffer is like much more stoic and like looking at one spot. It's rare for a bluffer to have a very genuine smile that like is dynamic and is a genuine smile that involves the eyes, which is like why some people try to get people involved in conversation after they've bet, to try to get little clues like that, make jokes and such. So just to say, there's a number of things that are just true of a general population that I would trust, assuming that I read somebody as a pretty recreational player, like assuming I don't think that they're like very skilled and capable of some, complex deception. I think most of the tells that I use are just tells, or most of the tells that are valuable in general are just general population tells that apply to general populations. And then it's just a matter of like, when you play with somebody for a few hours, have you seen some of those things play out in expected ways? If you haven't, then they're probably not a good person to focus on for getting tells from in the first place, which is true for a lot of people, right? Again, it's pretty rare to get a useful tell in the first place, and most of the tells you'll get will come from the more recreational players who are less skilled at being stoic and navigating and being balanced in these various spots. So yeah, the idea of baselining doesn't really play a role, other than saying like I might, I do like to watch people and get a sense of if they're deviating from my expectations, and so I could give you an example, a real example of this where I was surprised recently. I was doing this a live analysis, basically a live stream on YouTube, where had decided to do what I was doing with this high stakes poker player and hide the hole cards, hide the commentary, and just watch it biased, going in blind, and saying what I saw, just as a personal challenge. And I figured I'd do it out in the open. And one player, this millionaire player who's he's a pretty strong player, he's played a lot, Eric Pearson, he actually surprised me because I said it in a few spots. I was like, oh, he's doing these things that I think are strongly correlated with somebody being relaxed. Like he made a big bet and he was making very uncertain gestures, like, shaking his head or like doing like a shrug when he bet. There's these gestures and facial expressions that are highly correlated with somebody being relaxed, because you just won't see a bluffer. Getting back to that Joe Navarro thing, you won't see a bluffer often express uncertainty or confusion or hesitation in their body language or their facial expressions, but he was actually bluffing in a couple spots in a row, and it was so. I basically had never seen somebody do so many of those behaviors and be reversed, and I was like, wow, okay, he really surprised me. But getting to the baselining idea, the nice thing about this is like when you watch people, even for an hour or 2 hours, you'll fairly quickly get a sense if A, they're being pretty stoic and unreadable, or B, deviating in major ways from what you would expect to see from your average recreational player. So I think that's where the baselining comes in, because it's like, once I see Eric do that or somebody deviate from an expected pattern, I would immediately be like, oh, I gotta watch out, making any behavior-based reads on this person, because they're deviating from the general patterns and I have to watch them. And maybe it's even the case where they're deviating so much they're back at their tells are becoming readable again because they're deviating too much the other way in some sense. So I think that's where the baseline comes in. It's like, it's hard to get a real baseline, but when you already know that there's some of these behaviors that are common in a general population player pool, then it becomes a little bit easier to do, what you might call baselining or player specific reads in a shorter time frame, because then you're just looking like, are they abiding by some of the normal rules, or are they breaking the normal rules? And you can sometimes see that just in a few hands they play, right? So, and I wouldn't say, I think that's a much different thing than like going into an interrogation setting and trying to get a baseline in such an open-ended, there's no specific events and actions they're doing. It's just a completely open-ended, non-formalized environment, which the idea of baseline in that environment is just seems mind-blowingly impossible to me. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, it's the way I watched those folks talk about that stuff on video was it was almost embarrassing. It was so, catastrophically wrong what they were talking about, because they seem to completely ignore, and I don't know if they're just not, just don't want to go there, which is probably the case because it would challenge their skill set, to recognize that you're not even seeing all of these people in a way that you could establish what you're calling a baseline. If you don't see this person wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, how they talk to their wife, how they talk to their kids, how they drive, how they interact in a regular no stakes situation, how can you possibly be making evaluations about them in a high stakes situation? And calling and saying you're noticing deviations from regular average behavior on this person's part when you've never seen average behavior on this person's part. So I think this would be a similar thing to say about somebody sitting down at a poker table is, you have your general ideas of what people everywhere kind of do, but here we're talking about things as generalized as, people breathe. Like, like you can't say variations in breathing with this individual are going to mean something specific until you know this individual, right? So sure, if the person's sitting there hyperventilating, there's probably something wrong, but even then there could be about 3 or 4 reasons I could think of off the top of my head as to why somebody might be hyperventilating. So
for sure, there's definitely, to your point, it's like the idea when I see some of these alleged behavior experts claim that they're going to get an effective baseline that's of some practical use, and even just a few minutes, even a few hours is ridiculous to me, because the scenarios are so complex, so many unknowns, so many factors about why they could be thinking different things depending on different questions. It's like, it's just absurd to me. But to your point also, and in poker, it's like, I'm much less likely to make a read when somebody's first sat down. If I'm going to make a read, it's usually like after I've observed them a bit. But even then, as you say, it's like I'm often surprised by people, and I think some of the skill in the domain of poker, or any specific domain, is recognizing like, oh, this person has a lot of the attributes of a general certain player, recreational player. He does these things in these spots, therefore he'll probably do some of these other things in other spots, which makes you more comfortable relying on a read. But again, it's poker. It's like, sure, I'm playing numbers, but I'm comfortable being wrong sometimes. But that, drawing that over to the real world non-game spots, like there's very few spots where you would base a big decision on like a spot where you knew there's a good chance you might be wrong, right? So
exactly, right? I mean, I guess it would be as ridiculous as, I don't know, I'm just making up goofiness right now, but like, you try to put this into the lives of regular people in in a non I don't know, situation. I don't know. You go to get, to the bank, you're going to sign, you got the loan officer there, you're going to sign, and he raises his eyebrow in a weird way. And is that going to be the thing that's going to make you renege on the loan?
Right.
Are you going to really make a major life decision right now based on the fact this guy raised his eyebrow in a weird way? It's kind of like that level of, if you can kind of get that perspective of it. When you have a $50,000 pot in a poker game, I mean, you have to be like 99.9 to make a decision based on some guy's eyebrow, right?
No, actually, I mean, we could get into that.
No,
but
am I off on this?
No, because I think it's hard to, getting back to that, it's hard to understand the games if you're not in that world. But like poker and other games, a lot of the situations could go either way from a fundamental theory perspective, right? It's like, especially if you're playing good poker players, they're going to be balanced in such a way that like it's kind of like an even money decision whether you call or fold with a range of your hands.
Mm.
So
Okay.
this is just to say, even if you had a slight read that like something he did, some behavior he did, make skews it a bit more towards him bluffing or him value betting, you're more likely to get reads of somebody being strong than you are of being weak in those spots, because usually you're reading little signs of relaxation. But even if you had a slightly reliable read, because you're basically in these spots, you're making so many decisions, micro decisions over time, right? Like it's just one big game of making a bunch of decisions.
Right.
So
Right.
because you're making like hundreds, thousands of decisions, all these micro decisions, even a small read can go a long way, because you're going to be in that kind of spot many times. And so if a spot is fundamentally like even money to call or fold, then if you get a little bit of information, you can go a long way. And I
Oh,
think
sure.
that's one of the many reasons why game situations are so different from non-game situations, because that has like no analogy to a real world spot. I mean,
Right.
I guess theoretically, if like, I mean, I have thought about analogies where it's like, yeah, because people do make the, like, for example, there's these visa application, visa application things that people in embassies do for approving, denying visas. And
Yeah.
whether it's right or wrong, apparently a lot of these come down to just like the vibes that they get from people, because they see hundreds of people a day. And it seems really unfair from what I've read, because they'll
Yeah.
just be like, I didn't like whatever they did, so I'm denying them, right? And that's how it works, apparently. I'm actually going to interview somebody who's done that work for the podcast, because I got interested in like analogies for like making quick or micro decisions, many decisions. And
Yeah.
but this is just to say, I think there's very few decisions that should work that way in the real world. And non-game scenarios, like, they might work that way because you're rushed and you are forced to rely on like your vibes or something, but that's not like a great thing. And I don't think anybody would defend that that's a great way to make decisions when life or death or people's visas are involved. I think it's just very hard to find analogies, because the nice thing about games is it is a game. Like at the end of the day, you're playing for points or money, and you're making it's a game of numbers, so you make the decisions that you think will add up to you winning over time. But in the real world, where other people's lives are involved, it's hard to say defend basing big decisions on small little clues like that, right?
No, for sure, for sure. No, thank you for that. No, it's a very, very good clarification. I think you're absolutely right, making the differentiation also between games and real life, because games, of course, another way of putting it is games have rules, and everybody at the table is following those rules.
It's a very
Know,
formalized environment. Yeah.
yeah, it's a predictable environment to that degree. You know that they're not going to be able to put down an ace and it's going to suddenly equal some arbitrary value that's never equaled before. It's always going to be what the ace is at. In real life, somebody can pull that crap on you, and they can pull a fast one on you. So life is suddenly exponentially gets more complicated as a
Oh yeah.
result,
So
right?
much
Which
more
is why
complex. Yeah.
yeah, which is why I think we like games so much, and why they kind of give us a practice for life. But
Mhm.
it's not the same, and that's a great points you're making on that. Um, I think we've talked enough today that I want to start wrapping up, but I don't think we have exhaustively covered this particular topic. I'd be curious, very curious, to hear from my audience out there about what you want to know more about from Zach about this, because I've got about 5 different things right now that I'm thinking I want to ask you more about, but I don't want to go too long here today and try to data dump too much on people, because we've covered a lot of stuff. I think really important stuff as far as don't make too many assumptions, don't let your ego get in the way, guard against confirmation bias by always remembering that you can be wrong and have been wrong. Yet at the same time, we have all these safeguards in place, and yet there is something to learn here. There is something to know, but it's a high level sort of skill set, not a it's not going to substitute for knowing how to play the game, whether it's, an interrogation, or whether it's chess, or whether it's poker, or whether it's, whatever other high stakes situation you might be involved in, including cult manipulation, which is what this kind of, I've been talking about all this stuff today, sort of adjacent to cult manipulation. I hope that, y'all can draw the analogies here as to what is it that about all of this that cult leaders and cult members do or use when they're reading their victims or reading the people that they're preying upon, right? And how can you use this to maybe read them and, maybe some of their deceptive signs, right? Maybe they're a little tense when they should be relaxed. So there's things I think that all of us could learn and use in a number of scenarios from this. What do you think about what I just said?
Oh yeah, I do think there's a mapping over of like the wannabe gurus in the behavior space, and the all-encompassing life gurus, right? Like, and some of them, like Chase Hughes, trying to be both.
Yeah.
There is this draw that people have to wanting to be all-knowing or perceived as all-knowing, and then there's also a draw people have to wanting a guru, like wanting a behavior guru or wanting a life guru or a spiritual guru, what have you. Yeah, like these things they're real demands that supply and demand thing there.
That's right. Yeah, it's never going to go away. But for those who want to break out of that mold and think differently and do their life a little different, they listen to us. So
it's not as exciting, I've often said this, like nobody's going to offer me a TED talk to or some or sell some conference about like reading behavior in the real world, because it's just not that exciting. It's like just make some logical deductions and try not to get go down these bad rabbit holes of thinking. But it's much more exciting to claim that we can often read people and be amazing readers and see into people's souls and see what they're really like. That sells a lot more. Yeah.
That's right. As I think I just never forget this, because it was just one of the it was a phrase Joe Rogan said, and it just hit me in the hurts, because it's such a stupid thing to say. And yet, when I was growing up and when I was in Scientology, I thought it was brilliant. I thought this was exactly the way life works, right? Which is, that there's like a control board of the brain that you can hack. Right. You can get in there and get the hack code for the human mind, right? And it's like, dude, shut up.
Oh, well,
like, it doesn't work that way at all.
I mean, speaking of that, did you watch Joe Rogan interview Chase Hughes? I mean, that was a masterclass in complete bullshit about that kind of stuff. I mean, like, I'm just like, Joe Rogan should be ashamed of himself. Like, how do you not even be interested in vetting the bullshit that this guy is spewing? It's just depressing.
He's just too fascinated by it, and it's okay to be a little judgmental about bullshit. Anyway, Zach, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk with me today about all of this. And I've got another, about 20 questions listed out here. So I would very much like to bookmark another episode with you. But is there anything that you thought of today, or that we didn't cover today, that you thought we should have mentioned before we wrap up here?
No, that was great. Thanks a lot, Chris. I enjoy having these discussions. Yeah.
Awesome. Me too. You're a fun guest. Where do people contact you or reach out to you?
They can check out my behavior podcast website, behavior-podcast.com, for my people who read people podcasts. There's a contact page there if you're interested in my Poker Tells work. That's at readingpokertells.com. You can watch a fun little video of me acting on a tell, which I recently finally put up there on the site, just to give a granular example of using a tell. So that's, long story short, Poker Tells and the podcast.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Zach. And description and the links are in the description section below there for anybody who would like to reach out to Zach and find out more. Okay, folks, I will see you guys next week. So, of course, consider supporting the show through Patreon, PayPal, whatever. Throw me some love. It's always appreciated. And with that, see you guys next week. Bye bye.